everybody, welcome back to another story. My location has changed, as you can see. I'm at my parents' place today, visiting. My little bubba is sleeping next to me, so I gotta try and be in a shh. So today I think we were going with the Snow Queen, which is actually, funny enough, 7 different stories that make the one whole Snow Queen story. I think they're really small stories though, so we can actually do maybe them all in the same video. We'll see how it goes. Luckily this is actually in alphabetical order, this one. Snow Queen 505. But today we're reading the collection of stories from Hans Christian Andersen. I hope I said that correct. Look at this cover. How pretty is that? You've got the Snow Queen up on top. You've got the Little Mermaid down the bottom because they're more popular stories. And even on the back, it's so cute. It's got the little ugly duckling. Look at this. Look at this. It's so pretty. This book has like 133 stories in it. But it's still pretty substantial. Alright, so I'm going to go to 505. See, last time I made a mistake. My brain decided to go and I ended up on page 555 instead of 505. I don't know why. Don't ask. Okay. The Snow Queen in 7 stories. Story the first, which describes the looking glass and the broken fragments. You must attend to the commencement of this story, for when we get to the end we shall know more than we do now about a very wicked hobgoblin. He was one of the very worst, for he was a real demon. I don't see this part though. Is he a demon or is he a hobgoblin? Because they look two different. They look two different things. In my mind, anyway. So one day, when he was in a merry mood, he made a looking glass, which had the power of making everything good or beautiful that was reflected in it almost shrink to nothing, while everything that was worthless and bad looked increased in size and worse than ever. The most lovely landscapes appeared like boiled spinach, and the people became hideous, and looked as if they stood on their heads and had no bodies. Their countenances were so distorted that no one would recognize them, and even one freckle on the face appeared to spread over the whole of the nose and mouth. Okay, I take offense to that. I don't know if you can see, but I have freckles, okay? And this, I don't know. Freckles aren't worthless and bad. How dare you? How dare you, sir? This person obviously didn't like freckles, whoever wrote this. The demon said this was very amusing. When a good or pious thought passed through the mind of anyone, it was represented in the glass, and then how the demon laughed at his cunning intervention. When a good or pious thought passed through the mind of anyone, it was misrepresented in the glass, and then how the demon laughed at this cunning invention. All who went to the demon school, for he kept a school. So he was the principal? I think he was a principal. Talked everywhere of the wonders they had seen, and declared that people could now, for the first time, see what the world and mankind were really like. They carried the glass about everywhere, until at last there was not a land nor a people who had not been looked at through this distorted mirror. They wanted even to fly with it up to heaven to see the angels, but the higher they flew, the more slippery the glass became, and then they could scarcely hold it, until at last it slipped from their hands, fell to the earth, and was broken into 1,000,000 pieces. But now the looking glass caused more unhappiness than ever, for some of the fragments were not so large as a grain of sand, and they flew about the world into every country. When one of these tiny atoms flew into a person's eye, it stuck there, unknown to him, and from the moment he saw everything through a distorted medium, or could only see the worst side of what he looked at, for even the smallest fragment retained the same power which had belonged to the whole mirror. Some few persons even got a fragment of the looking glass into their hearts, and this was very terrible, for their hearts became cold like clumps of ice, like a lump of ice. A few of the pieces were so large that they could be used as window panes. It would have been a sad thing to look at our friends through them. Other pieces were made into spectacles. This was dreadful for those who had worn them, for they could see nothing, neither rightly or justly. At all this, the wicked demon laughed till his sides shook. It tickled him so to see the mischief he had done. There were still a number of these little fragments of glass floating about in the air, and now you shall hear what happened with one of them. Second story, a little boy and a little girl. I'm going to check to see how many pages this is. Oh, it's only 20 pages. It should be fine. In a large town full of houses and people, there was not room for everyone to have even a little garden. Therefore, they are obliged to be satisfied with a few flowers and flower pots. In one of these large towns lived two poor children, who had a garden something larger and better than a few flower pots. They were not brother and sister, but they loved each other almost as much as if they had been. Their parents lived opposite to each other in two garrets, where the roofs of neighbouring houses projected out towards each other, and the water pipe ran between them. In each house was a little window, so that anyone could step across the gutter from one window to the other. That is way too close. Like, a lot close. I don't know how houses are in other countries, but in Australia we don't tend to have houses that close. The parents of these children had each a large wooden box in which they cultivated kitchen herbs for their own use, and a little rose bush in each box, which grew splendidly. Now, after a while, the parents decided to place those two boxes across the water pipe, so they reached from one window to the other and looked like two banks of flowers. Sweet peas drooped over the boxes, and the rose bushes shot forth long branches, which were trained around the windows, and clustered together almost like a triumphal arch of leaves and flowers. The boxes were very high, and the children knew they must not climb upon them without permission. But they were often, however, allowed to step out together to sit upon their little stools under the rose bushes, or play quietly. So I don't know, sure. Is there like a wall next to their house, or are they side by side like this? Like their house windows are like this? Or are they like this? Or are they both up against a wall on each side? I'm trying to picture it in my mind. But different things are displaying different, making it look different. In winter, all this pleasure came to an end, for the windows were sometimes quite frozen over. But then they would warm copper pennies on the stove and hold the warm pennies against the frozen plane. There would be very soon a little round hole through which they could peep, and the soft bright eyes of the little boy and girl would beam through the hole at each window as they looked at each other. That's cold. Like, when I first read this, I thought it was like they put the warm pennies on the actual glass. But now I'm starting to think that the windows were open. They were just literally frozen over. Like, that is cold. Like, cold. Their name, the kids' names were Kay and Gerda. It's either Kay or Kai. and Gerda, K-A-Y, is Kai, right? It would have to be. And Gerda. In summer, they could be together with one jump from the window, but in winter they had to go up and down the long staircase and out through the snow before they could meet. "See, there are white bees swarming," said Kay's old grandmother one day when it was snowing. "Have they a queen bee?" asked the little boy, for he knew the real bees had a queen. "To be sure they have," said the grandma. "She is flying there with the swarm is thickest. She is the largest of them all, and never remains on the earth, but flies up to the dark clouds. Often at midnight she flies through the streets of the town." I said clown. Often at midnight she flies through the streets of the town and looks at the windows. Then the ice freezes on the plains into wonderful shapes that look like flowers and castles. "Yes, I have seen them," said both the children, and they knew it must be true. "Can the Snow Queen come in here?" asked the little girl. "Only let her come," said the boy, "and I'll set her on the stove and then she'll melt." That escalated quickly. Then the grandmother smoothed his hair and told him some more tales. One evening, when little Kay was at home half undressed, he climbed onto a chair by the window and peeped out through the little hole. A few flakes of snow were falling, and one of them, rather larger than the rest, alighted on the edge of one of the flower boxes. This snowflake grew larger and larger, until at last it became the figure of a woman, dressed in garments of white gauze, which looked like millions of starry snowflakes linked together. She was fair and beautiful, but made of ice, shining and glittering ice. Still she was alive, and her eyes sparkled like bright stars, but there was neither peace nor rest in their glance. She nodded towards the window and waved her hand. The little boy was frightened and sprang from the chair. At the same moment it seemed as if a large bird flew by the window. On the following day there was clear frost, and very soon came the spring. The sun shone, the green leaves burst forth, the swallow built the nests, windows were opened, and the children sat once more in the garden on the roof, high above all the other rooms. How beautiful the roses blossomed this summer. The little girl had learnt a hymn in which the roses were spoken of, and then she thought of her own roses, and she sang the hymn to the little boy, and he sang too. "Roses bloom and cease to be, but we shall the Christ child see." Then the little ones held each other by the hand and kissed the roses, and looked at the bright sunshine, and spoke to it as if the Christ child was there. Those were splendid summer days. How beautiful and fresh it was out among the rose bushes. I'm pretty sure spring comes after winter, not summer, but okay. Sure. How beautiful and fresh it was out among the rose bushes, which seemed as if they would never leave off blooming. One day Kay and Gerda sat looking at a book full of pictures of animals and birds, and just then, as a clock in the church tower struck 12, Kay said, "Oh, something has struck my heart." And soon after, "Oh, there's something in my eye." The little girl put her arm around his neck and looked into his eye, but she could see nothing. "I think it's gone," he said. But it was not gone. It was one of those bits of the looking glass, the magic mirror of which we have already spoken. The ugly glass which made everything great and good appear small and ugly, while all that was wicked and bad became more visible, and every little fault could be plainly seen. Poor little Kay had also received a small grain in his heart, which was very quickly turning into a lump of ice. He felt no more pain, but the glass was still there. "Why do you cry?" he said at last. "It makes you look ugly. There is nothing the matter with me now." "Oh, see!" he cried suddenly. "That rose is worm-eaten, and this one is quite crooked. After all, they are ugly roses, just like the box in which they stand. and then he kicked the boxes with his foot and pulled off the 2 roses. "Kai, what are you doing?" cried the little girl. And then, when he saw how frightened she was, he tore off another rose and jumped through his own window away from little Gerda. When she afterwards brought out the picture book, he said it was only fit for babies in long clothes. When the grandmother told any stories, he would interrupt her with "but," or, when he could manage it, he would get her behind her chair and put on a pair of spectacles and imitate her very cleverly, to make people laugh. By and by, he began to mimic the speech and gait of persons in the street. All that was particular or disagreeable in a person, he would imitate directly, and people said, "That boy would be very clever. He has a remarkable genius." He was being a dickhead. Maybe they're being sarcastic? Doesn't sound like sarcasm, though. But what would I know? I can't even understand sarcasm when it's spoken to me, let alone on paper. But it was the piece of glass in his eye and the coldness in his heart that made him act like this. He would even tease little Gerda, who loved him with all her heart. His games, too, were quite different. They were not so childish. One winter's day, when it snowed, he brought out a burning glass. Then he held out the tail of his blue coat and let the snowflakes fall upon it. "Look in this glass, Gerda," said he, and she saw how every flake of snow was magnificent and looked like a beautiful flower or a glittering star. "Is it not clever?" said Kay, "and much more interesting than looking at real flowers. There's not a single fault in it, and the snowflakes are quite perfect until they begin to melt." Soon after, Kai made his appearance in long, thick gloves and with his sleigh at his back. He called upstairs to Gerda, "I've got to leave to go into the great square while the other boys play and ride." And away he went. In the great square, the boldest among the boys would often tie their sleighs to the country people's carts and go with them a good way. I'm pretty sure this is how kidnapping happens too. Why is no one ever pointing that out? It's like, oh, hey, this person was kidnapped, but we're going to keep doing it, yeah? We have no idea who we're tying it to. Oh, look, and actually, yeah, this is probably the reason why, isn't it? This was capital. But while they were all amusing themselves, and Kai along with them, a great sleigh came by. It was painted white, and in it sat someone wrapped in a rough white fur and wearing a white cap. The sleigh drove twice around the square, and Kai fastened his own little sled to it, so that when it went away, he followed with it. It went faster and faster right through to the next street, and when the person who drove turned around and nodded pleasantly to Kai, just as if they were acquainted with each other. But whenever Kai wished to loosen his little sled, the driver nodded again. So Kai sat still, and they drove out through the town gate. It's kidnapping. It was just kidnapped, folks. Then the snow began to fall so heavily that the little boy could not see a hand's breadth before him, but still they drove on. I mean, wouldn't you see something was suspicious the first... Oh, I don't know. Maybe because he's a boy, he probably wouldn't notice how suspicious that is. Yes, here. But still they drove on. Then suddenly he loosened the cord so that the large sled might go on without him. But it was of no use. His little carriage held fast, and away they went like the wind. Then he called out loudly, but nobody heard him. "Jump off the sleigh." Why, the snow beat upon him, and the sled flew onwards. Every now and then it gave a jump, as if they were going over hedges and ditches. The boy was frightened, and tried to say a prayer. But he could remember nothing but the multiplication table. The snowflakes became larger and larger until they appeared like great white chickens. All at once they sprang on one side, and the great sled stopped, and the person who had driven it rose up. The fur and the cap, which were made entirely of snow, fell off, and he saw a lady, tall and white. It was the Snow Queen. He just got kidnapped. He was just literally kidnapped. and then taken far away from the city. That's how kidnapping happens. I told you. I told you. Told you. I knew that was going to happen. I've actually never read this story before. I'm like, it's definitely someone's getting kidnapped. We have driven well, said she, but why do you tremble? Here, creep into my warm fur. Then she seated him beside her in the sledge as she wrapped the fur around him. He felt as if he was sinking into a snowdrift. Are you still cold? She asked, and she kissed him on the forehead. The kiss was colder than ice, and it went straight quite through to his heart, which was already almost a lump of ice. He felt as if he was going to die, but only for a moment. He soon seemed quite well again, and did not notice the cold around him. My sleigh! Don't forget my sleigh! Was the first thought, and then he looked and saw that it was bound fast to one of the white chickens, which flew behind him with the sled at his back. The Snow Queen kissed little Kai once again, and by this time he had forgotten little Gerda, his grandmother, and all at home. Now you must have no more kisses, she said, or I shall kiss you to death. Why does she want this boy? Kai looked at her and saw that she was so beautiful he could not imagine a more lovely and intelligent face. She did not now seem to be made of ice, as when he had seen her through his window, and she had nodded to him. In his eyes she was perfect, and she did not feel at all afraid. He told her he could do mental arithmetic as far as fractions, and that he knew the number of square miles and the number of inhabitants in the country. And she always smiled, so that he thought he did not know enough yet. And she looked around the vast expanse as she flew higher and higher with him upon a black cloud, while the storm blew and howled as if it was singing old songs. They flew over woods and lakes, over seas and lands. Below them roared the wild wind. The wolf howled and the snow crackled. Over them flew the black screaming crows, and above all shone the moon, clear and bright, so that Kai passed through the winter's night, and by day he slept at the feet of the Snow Queen. Interesting. It's kind of interesting that he's got the mirror that sees all it's ugly, but to her, she must actually be fully perfect for him not to notice anything. Like, there's no flaws on her body. It's like there can't be, because he's not seeing any nasty stuff. I mean, it would be amplified. All the beautiful thing would be taken away, right? But it's kind of creepy that he sees everything as ugly and yet finds her perfect. Honestly, I'd be like so suspicious at that point. Alright, I'll stop it there and I'll read the next two stories. Or the third and fourth story. Alright,